Morbius the Living Vampire is here. Finally, after like 8 years of waiting, it feels like. The jury is still out on whether the movie will be any good or not, but we can at least agree that Morbius is a fascinating character who deserves his time in the sun. Metaphorically speaking, of course. And the best way to do that is to make him fight a bunch of other Marvel heroes. Which superheroes do you think Morbius could beat in a fight? His mortal frenemy Spider-Man?
What's the rush?
Doctor Strange? Deadpool? There's a lot of options, so join me as I use some comic history, some MCU history, and just general imagination to discuss how Morbius can beat everyone. Let's get started. Of course, I have to talk about Spider-Man for the first entry on this list. Morbius was originally introduced as a Spidey villain back in the 70s in the Amazing Spider-Man issue 101. There, his living vampire name took shape. He looked normal during the day, but under the moonlight he would transform into his Morbius persona, and here's the weird thing. His clothes change as well. He goes from normal plain clothes to his prominent blue and red jumpsuit without an explanation after his transformation. Does that outfit change come with being a vampire? Or does Vampire Morbius keep that outfit in a hidden place nearby for style points? It's unclear. Anyways, when he's first introduced, you can tell he hates his existence. He seems like a good man, but he's just too consumed with his hunger for blood, you know, like a vampire. And then from there, his story expanded. What started as a simple villain for Spider-Man soon grew worthy enough to have his own compelling comic line where he always toes the line between antihero and villain. Mainly, it's been more of a hero recently, which I think is the better way to treat the character. But that brings us back to Spider-Man, his first enemy. The two have clashed countless times over the years, with their battles not ending with Spider-Man turning into a vampire Spider-Man, but that doesn't mean that Morbius doesn't put up a good fight. He's normally super strong, fast, agile, and has a series of advanced senses. He can also glide through the air and once gained the ability to mesmerize people with his vampire stare, which is an ability that will come in handy when he's up against these other heroes later on. So in the right circumstances, I think he could beat Spidey, but I want to use the rest of this Spider-Man entry to talk about the live-action world. We know Morbius is part of the Sonyverse, and that's also sort of part of the MCU now, but it's still so unclear how the two fit together. So my question is, which live-action Spider-Man could Morbius most likely fight and beat? Let's start with Tom Holland. Yes, Tom Holland is proving to be the strongest Spider-Man, but I also think his teenager status would affect him in this fight. I think he'll be a bit too frightened of Morbius to think clearly, and that could give Morbius the edge.
What? Why?
Tobey Maguire, I think, could beat Morbius pretty easily given all he's been through and experienced, and that leaves Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, which is perhaps the most interesting matchup. Logistically, Garfield's Spider-Man fits in the best with the aesthetic of the Sonyverse and would provide an excellent challenge from Jared Leto's Morbius. Was all this just a way to say that Andrew Garfield should be in the Sonyverse? Yes, it was. Let's make it happen so we can see a Morbius versus Spider-Man fight in live action, please.
It is weird staring at you for that long.
Surprisingly, one of the heroes that Morbius the Living Vampire has the biggest history with is none other than the Sorcerer Supreme himself, Doctor Strange.
Well, that was the plan.
Morbius is a creature of the night, and depending on how you look at his disease, it's either some sort of curse, which falls in line with the normal things a sorcerer deals with, or it's more of a medical virus, and if that's the case, well, Doctor Strange is an actual doctor after all. But what happened when these two crossed paths? Well, it's happened a few times. One time, the Evil Nightmare, a villain who could very well be the villain for the upcoming Multiverse of Madness, possessed Morbius and used him to attack Doctor Strange. Morbius is so brutally quick and efficient that Strange doesn't have time to cast any proper defense magic and actually loses the fight, leading to Nightmare possessing Doctor Strange's body. Things all worked out though, as after Morbius is freed from being possessed, he works to rescue Doctor Strange. See, he's a nice vampire. But then there's also a whole comic issue a bit later when Morbius bites the neck of Victor Strange, Doctor Strange's brother. You see, Victor was thought to be deceased, and Morbius took him out of a cryogenic freezing warehouse, which sounds a little kooky, doesn't it? You think some of the warehouses you pass on your way to work or something has just piles of frozen people in it? I hope not. Anyway, Morbius bites Vic, who wakes up and runs off. So not only has Morbius technically beat Doctor Strange physically, but that's just a low blow turning a family member into a vampire, right? The idea of Deadpool fighting Morbius is low-key hilarious for a few reasons. Like, for one, let's look at the meta angle a bit. Can you imagine a situation where Deadpool is so upset that Morbius of all characters got another movie before he did that he decides to hunt down and eliminate all the Sonyverse?
Come in. Hey.
Like, there's that fun storyline about Deadpool wiping out all the other Marvel heroes, so why not adapt that into live action and make it a Deadpool versus the Sonyverse movie? And first up on his list would definitely be Morbius. I mean, Deadpool lives for weird stuff, and I think he'd believe it was the cool thing to hunt down a vampire.
Oh, God. I'm gonna throw up in my mouth.
Especially once we find out that Deadpool thinks Jared Leto is a bit of a weird dude and wants him to stop acting weird in all his movie roles.
You're gonna be my friend.
He'd also try to get Morbius to sign his 30 Seconds to Mars CD, which I think would be hilarious. Okay, all major jokes aside, what would this fight look like? The problem with Deadpool is that he has one of the best regeneration abilities in all of Marvel Comics. You can do just about anything to him and he'd just bounce back to his normally quippy self in no time. Though maybe this is a benefit for Morbius. If Morbius finds a way to capture Deadpool, then he basically has an unlimited supply of blood, as Deadpool always regenerates. I also think Morbius's mesmer ability wouldn't work on Wade Wilson. Not because he has this incredible willpower or anything like that, but rather just because I think Deadpool's mind is so warped and chaotic that I don't think brainwashing would work. So does Morbius have a chance? Honestly, it's going to be tough.
You're absolutely right.
Morbius could maybe get a lucky shot on Deadpool that incapacitates him for a bit, but any victory is going to be short-lived. Morbius has just gotta hope that Deadpool wants to try being a vampire for a bit and lets himself get bitten. That counts as a win for Morbius, right? Though I really don't know how good Deadpool's blood would actually taste. With Morbius being the second franchise in the growing Sonyverse, the big question becomes when Venom and Morbius are going to meet up and will they form their own version of the Sinister Six? It's certainly possible, but the most likely option before becoming friends is that they'll probably tussle first because it's a comic book movie. You gotta have your main characters fight each other at some point, right? So when push comes to shove, who do you have in a fight? In one corner, you have Venom, a symbiote from another planet that's formed a unique relationship with Eddie Brock to become a lethal protector. Venom is super strong, fast, and it's really hard to damage him without sound or fire. Sure, he might be a little goofy and want to feast on bad guys to the point of getting distracted, but he's not to be messed with. But on the Morbius side of things, he's going to be no slouch either. Trailers have revealed Morbius being all vampire-like as you'd expect, and he seems just as strong as Venom and potentially even faster. Plus, he seems to be able to control bats, and imagine the type of noise bats could make if they were swarming around Venom. That would be enough to disorient the symbiote, so I think it would be a pretty fair fight. And have the two ever traded blows in the comics? Yes. There's one storyline called The Enemy Within, which sees Venom facing a tiny goblin swarm in San Francisco. Through some classic comic mix-up, both Morbius and Venom meet underground in the city, and think the other is working with the goblins, and they briefly fight it out. Of course, they soon realize they need to be allies and team up to stop the goblin swarm together. It's a neat story and shows off just how well the two can work together. Okay, this is probably the one everyone's waiting for. Morbius the Living Vampire versus Blade the Vampire Hunter.
Quick.
It's a match made in heaven. And let's talk about options to see this in the MCU. We know Blade is getting his own solo movie, and he's already popped up at the end of Eternals, seemingly teaming up with the future Black Knight. I assume they're going to be some type of underground, darker Avengers-style team. And Morbius over in the Sonyverse seems like he's about to team up with Michael Keaton's Vulture.
Hot dog.
And probably sometime soon, Venom. So that's two super teams that I would be fascinated to see interact with each other. So in Blade versus Morbius, who has the advantage? Well, definitely Blade, right? I mean, he's specifically a vampire hunter. It's his whole shtick. Plus, him being half vampire definitely gives him a bit of an advantage. But on the other side of things, Morbius is way smarter and arguably stronger than a lot of vampires that Blade normally hunts. Morbius's genius intellect might be enough to anticipate Blade's moves though and spring a counterattack if necessary. Though as wonderful as it would be to see these two battle it out in live action like they have in the comics, I don't think we'll ever be satisfied with the outcome because it's not like one could feasibly take the other one out. They both have new franchises to lead. But what if it's a moral victory for Morbius? What if Blade is still in an all vampires are bad type of mindset, and when he meets Morbius, who is a vampire that yes gives in to his need for blood every now and then, but also is trying to be a hero, antihero, it helps Blade realize that maybe there's a cure for vampires rather than just eliminating them completely. That would be a fun arc to see play out, don't you think? The Punisher would have a hard time beating Morbius, I imagine. Out of everyone on this list, Frank Castle is the only one without any special superhuman powers, and that would wind up costing him dearly in a fight. Now, I would say it depends on the situation. If these two characters just randomly ran into each other somewhere and started fighting, then the Punisher is at a major disadvantage, and would probably become nothing but a tasty snack for Morbius. But on the other hand, if Punisher had significant prep time, you would imagine he would load up with all sorts of vampire hunting goodies in order to make the fight a bit more even. And yes, while it would be more fair that way, I still think Morbius pulls out a victory here. His strength, speed, stamina, and his smarts are not something Punisher can just blast away with his arsenal. It would be fun to see though. What would happen if the Hulk was bit by a vampire? Or if Bruce Banner was bit by a vampire? I would assume if the big guy gets infected with vampirism, then he might just shrug it off and his irradiated blood would just dissolve any traces of the vampire virus. And I guess Bruce would work the same way, right? But I don't know, the concept of Bruce turning into a vampire and then still hulking out whenever he got super angry just seems a little comical. And of course, the idea of a somehow vampire Hulk is terrifying. Can you imagine the fangs and the force of his bites? How much blood would he have to go through to satisfy his thirst? I think a Hulk and Morbius fight would be interesting to say the least. Obviously, the strength element goes to Hulk, but hear me out on this one. Could Morbius hypnotize Hulk? We know Morbius has his mesmerism skill, and only those with strong enough willpower can overcome it. But the Hulk is usually just a big, mindless brute, right? That should be easy to take control of. In live action, we saw how easy it was for Scarlet Witch to use her mind-controlling abilities to basically hypnotize Hulk, so why couldn't Morbius do the exact same thing? But without that mesmerism, I don't think Morbius stands much of a chance, at least against the Hulk. Morbius may be strong and extra fast, but I don't think there's a lot Morbius can do to truly hurt the Hulk. But Bruce Banner, I guess, is a different story. I think there's a compelling story to be told about Morbius and Bruce Banner meeting and either fighting or becoming close friends. I mean, the MCU said Bruce Banner has 7 PhDs and Michael Morbius has a PhD in biochemistry. They're both doctors and they could bond over their cursed lifestyle. Plus, Morbius is always trying to help find cures for various diseases across the Marvel Universe, so I think he and Bruce would bond over their love of science. But then, of course, Bruce just has to watch out that Morbius doesn't get too hungry. So the MCU is about to start delivering holiday specials to us very soon, and one of the first will be a Halloween special all about Werewolf by Night. The Werewolf by Night project is still shrouded in secrecy, but now that we have confirmation that it's coming, we can start our petitions to get Morbius and Werewolf by Night to fight one another. Morbius and Werewolf by Night do have a comic history, and traditionally, they're allies. At least, Morbius and the first Werewolf by Night, Jack Russell, are. There's another Werewolf by Night named Jake Gomez who was introduced in comic continuity in 2020, so it will be interesting to see which one the MCU goes with. In the comics, Morbius recruits the Jack version of the lycanthrope to join his version of the Midnight Suns, and even works to help cure Jack of his werewolf curse. I do think overall a vampire is stronger and smarter than a werewolf though, so I think in a battle, Morbius would take this one. With mostly everyone on this list, I keep asking myself the question of how would this specific character react to seeing a vampire, and how would they adjust to fight it? And Captain America seems like he wouldn't be frazzled in the same way that someone like Peter Parker would be, for instance. But does that calm and steady attitude translate to a victory in a fight with a living vampire? You know, I don't think so.
I could do this all day.
Yes, Cap is one of the best brawlers in the Avengers, but there's a part of me that would think Morbius would get the jump on Captain America. Like, Captain America could easily win this fight, but he would think that underneath Morbius's outer vampire shell is a man who's trapped fighting his worst impulses, and that would mean Cap would try to save him. And that compassion just might end up hurting Cap when dealing with a bloodthirsty vampire. It's a long shot, yes, but I think it's the only way for Morbius to beat Captain America. I wanted to end on a bit of a fun one. I know Morbius and Iron Man don't normally run in the same social circles, but I wonder how someone like Tony Stark would handle someone like Morbius. Obviously, Tony has the advantage because as long as he's in his metal suit, it would be hard for Morbius to bite Tony's fleshy exterior. So Morbius would have to rely on his strength and speed in order to subdue and beat Iron Man. But again, how would Tony approach this battle? Would he come in with a scientific mind and try to find a way to cure Morbius? Or would he immediately surrender to all the vampire myths and show up wearing a garlic necklace while doused in holy water? It's a real shame Tony didn't make it out of Endgame because seeing him handle creatures like vampires and werewolves would have been a real treat.
Come on.
For some reason, I really want to see Morbius have to fight Ant-Man in the MCU. Scott Lang seems like the type of guy to be terrified by vampires, and I want to see how Morbius handles the challenge of beating a shrinking man. What other fun matchups can you envision? There's a lot for sure.